of the Forgotten Years. This is the first in our series of 6 weekly lectures on this year's theme, which is the common good. The descriptions and registration links for all of the lectures are found on our newly redesigned website at historicbostons.org. Naturally, there are donation links on that website too. We wouldn't mind if you use them. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Francis Bremer, Professor Emeritus of History at Millersville University. He is the author of 19 books about Puritanism. In this talk, Dr. Bremer examines how Governor John Winthrop and others believed they should live and interact with one another to achieve their vision. Their vision was of a society in which all members would labor to assist one another. What was that world like? And what was that social gospel that they lived and created? After examining how the colonials' behavior expressed their social gospel, Dr. Bremer, who was a longtime advisor to the partnership, we call him Frank, will suggest how this element of the Puritan legacy is relevant to us today. In an interview about his most recent book, One Small Candle, The Plymouth Puritans and the Beginning of English New England, Dr. Bremer stated, I quote, "While acknowledging their warts, I wanted to explore some elements of their story that are worth of our consideration. Their belief in the lay empowerment contributed to forms of participatory government in their congregation towns and other political entities not found elsewhere. Their belief in the importance of reading itself led them to require that all men and women and servants and slaves, all of them, be taught to read. Their openness to further light as religious developed made them less dogmatic than most of their religious contemporaries. And finally, their commitment to the welfare of the larger community as opposed to individual self-advancement provided their model for social gospel." Dr. Bremer's interest in New England started early as a young boy visiting New England with his family, and he has always been rooted in the landscape and what he tells us. He says, "I relish seeing the grounds on which battles have been fought and over which armies have marched. I have found my understanding of the 17th century men and women is enhanced by spending time in that places where they lived and where they studied and where they labored." I am sure we've all experienced that feeling. I certainly have. And I hope that the partnership walking tours, as well as our lectures and reading groups, convey that emotion. I welcome you to join us in these, our endeavors. Dr. Bremer will talk for about an hour or a little longer. There will be a question and answer period after Dr. Bremer's talk. During his talk, please type your questions as they emerge to you into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the talk, they will be read and answered by Frank. That being said, I am proud and honored to introduce Dr. Francis Bremer, who will speak on Puritan social gospel and the common good. Take it away, Dr. Bremer.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you to all of you who are watching. Before getting to the focus of this evening's presentation, I would like to reflect on how public understanding of the Puritans and the beginning of English New England has changed over the past years as we've begun to mark the 400th anniversaries of the events that shaped the region between 1620, 1630, and beyond. There's no doubt that during the past few years, one of the more important developments in our attempts to know more about New England's beginnings is the attention that has been paid to the native peoples of the region, the inhabitants of what they themselves referred to as Dawnland. Europeans who had sailed the coast before 1620 had combined exploration and trade with kidnapping native peoples to display them in Europe as oddities or to immerse them in European society so as to teach them English or other languages, enabling them to serve later as interpreters. In the course of such voyages, those Europeans inadvertently introduced diseases that proved deadly to up to 90% of the native population in some communities. Patuxet, a thriving Wampanoag village, was almost completely wiped out, in the years just before the Mayflower arrived, and its passengers, the Mayflower passengers, renamed Patuxet Plymouth. For a time, it was in the interest of both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags to enter into a mutual assistance pact that produced peace between those two groups for half a century. But eventually, and earlier in other parts of New England, English expansion and cultural conflict led to war, further reduction of the native population, and the enslavement of native captives. These are some of the negative dimensions of New England's beginnings, and it's important that they be recognized. But in discussing these undeniable sins of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, we must not tell only that part of the story, focusing on one detail of the picture at the expense of the whole. When, in the early 1650s, the English Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell sat to have his portrait painted, he is said to have told the artist, Peter Lely, "I desire you would use all your skill to paint your picture truly like me. Remark all this roughness, pimples, warts, and everything you see on me." Similar instructions should guide us as we depict the past. Paint the full picture, tell the story, warts and all. We should not erase and ignore the warts, nor make the warts all that is portrayed. We need to contend with the negative aspects of the Puritan story, but we also need to reclaim what is good and worthy of remembering. And this includes their social gospel and their belief that no one people or race had a monopoly on salvation. Prior to the departure of what we have come to refer to as the Winthrop fleet, John Winthrop addressed the men and women who were to join him, delivering a lay sermon in the Church of the Holy Rood in Southampton, England. Generally referred to as the model of Christian charity, it is the logical place to start a discussion of Puritan views of society and the promotion of the common good. There is no first-person record of someone who actually heard this sermon, which likely testifies to the important fact that the message was already familiar to the audience. The only 17th century copy of the sermon is not in Winthrop's handwriting, but is evidently a copy made for possible circulation, an example of what David Hall has called scribal publication, and with a cover written much later. The scholar Abram van Engen has persuasively argued that the sermon is incomplete, missing the opening scripture passage and exposition normal with a Puritan sermon. Based on a careful reading of what remains, he suggests that Winthrop initially opened with Galatians 5, verses 13 and 14. "For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not your liberty as an occasion unto the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, which is this: thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." The most famous and misrepresented passage of Winthrop's sermon is the one in which he told those joining him in the plantation of Massachusetts that if they did their utmost to understand and live by God's wishes, they would be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. I say this has been misrepresented because many historians and other writers have claimed that this is the beginning of the idea of American exceptionalism, that Winthrop was asserting a uniqueness for the colony and the country that emerged from it. But in actuality, the Massachusetts governor was not claiming any such uniqueness, but issuing a familiar call based on Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 to 16, that the members of the community he was addressing live exemplary lives, providing a model of godliness that would inspire others to do the same. By exploring this, we can shed light on what I call the Puritan social gospel. 10 years earlier, in the fall of 1620, another layman, Deacon Robert Cushman of the Plymouth Colony's congregation, had preached a similar sermon in that colony. Published in England in 1622, it is likely that John Winthrop had read it as he perused all he could about the challenges of emigration to America. Cushman's sermon is another early statement of the Puritan social gospel, and on occasion this evening, I shall quote from that as well. The metaphors of a city on a hill and a candle on a candlestick to describe particularly godly communities and individuals was a commonplace of Puritan preaching. Cushman did not, as Winthrop did, employ the specific image of a city upon a hill in his 1621 sermon, but the idea is implicit. And he expressed its essence in a separate discussion of Congregationalism that he published, writing that, quote, Mount Zion is everywhere, and every Christian is both the temple of the Lord in a sense, as also a little mountain of holiness, from whom the law of God and his will must flow out of all just occasions to neighbors, brethren, countrymen, strangers, etc., yea, to any, good or bad, that will give attention. And Cushman did predict in his Plymouth sermon, so also shall you be an encouragement to many of your Christian friends in your native country to come to you when they hear of your peace, love, and the kindness that is among you. Central to living exemplary lives was that individuals love their neighbors as themselves. This was the heart of the Puritan social gospel. It entailed rejecting temptations to self-love and self-aggrandizement and placing the common good over that of the individual. Winthrop spoke in his sermon about the dangerous spread in England of an ethos of pursuing individual self-interest. His view of God's will demanded, as he put it, that the care of the public must oversway private respects, and that rather than seek to accumulate as much personal wealth as possible, the colonists must be willing, as he said, to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. Cushman made a similar argument about the destructive consequences of self-love. He claimed that too many of his generation think, as he said, to have more in this world, being born, as they think, to take their pleasures and their ease. Let the roof of the house drop through, they stir not, he preached. Let the field be overgrown with weeds, they care not. They must not soil their hand, nor wet their foot. It is enough for them to say, go you, not let us go, though never so much need. And he went on to say that such idle drones are intolerable in a settled commonwealth, but much more in a commonwealth which is but, as it were, in the bud. For these two men and other Puritans, society was like a body, with each member playing a key role in the health of the whole. Cushman exhorted the Plymouth colonist to labor to be joined together as one body and knit by flesh and sinews. Away with envy at the good of others, and rejoice in his good, and sorrow for his evil. Let his joy be your joy, and his sorrow thy sorrow. Let his sickness be thy sickness, his hunger thy hunger, his poverty thy poverty. And if you profess friendship, Cushman said, be friends in adversities, for then a friend is known and tried, and not before. 10 years later, Winthrop made the same argument, saying, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community as members of the same body. The Puritans strove to assist those whom they considered fellow members of their social body, their community. And this is an important part of our story this evening. But how did they define their community? To whom did their social outreach extend? To fully understand the operation of the Puritan social gospel in early New England, we need to understand this as well. Every community, be it a town, state, nation, church, denomination, etc., now and in the past, establishes what the English historian Alexander Walsham has called a perimeter fence, a formal or informal boundary dividing what beliefs, people, and practices are allowed within the community and those that are beyond the pale. The New Englanders' early efforts to erect a city on a hill included an ongoing debate over where to place the perimeter fence. There was considerable diversity among the Puritans who were challenged by this task. Some came to America convinced that they had arrived at a sufficient knowledge of proper religious and social belief and practice, and they sought to make that the orthodoxy that all must subscribe to. But others believed that they could learn more. John Winthrop epitomized this latter approach in his Christian charity sermon, where he told his fellow colonists that if they did their best to keep the unity of the spirit in the bond of peace, God would reward them and they would see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we were acquainted with. There is an openness here to further light. And again, this is not unique to Winthrop. Those whom we call the Pilgrims declared in the original covenant they swore to when forming their congregation in Scrooby, England, that they would adhere to all of God's, quote, ways made known or to be made known unto them, whatsoever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them. And later on, their pastor, John Robinson, urged them to be open to further light, convinced, as he put it, the Lord hath more truth and light yet to break forth out of his holy word. For those who were open to new insights, if someone proposed what might be a better way forward, expressing a belief that appeared contrary to accepted wisdom, that view was to be openly discussed, weighed against Scripture, and tested by the insight the Holy Spirit had given to all members of the community. Engaging in such debate required humility and charity. All engaged in the search for further light acknowledged that even with the help of the Spirit, they were looking through a glass darkly and might be wrong. Discussion did not always result in a new consensus. When a church could not agree on a particular matter of doctrine or practice, its members were urged to pray and to wait for further light. Furthermore, those so engaged should accept the good faith of those they disagreed with and treat them with civility, as reflected in the advice of Roxbury's pastor John Eliot. Brother, learn the meaning of these three little words: bear, forbear, forgive. Or as Winthrop put it, improve that which is profitable and cover the rest with love. Of course, this advice was likely to be heeded only by those who saw value in seeking further light. And so the process was not always a smooth one. If Puritans, such as Winthrop, were open to keeping the perimeter fence set widely enough so as to allow the exploration of new views, others were opposed to any suggestion that the beliefs they held were anything but foundational truths. These different attitudes necessarily influenced events in both the religious and civil spheres. If Winthrop can be seen as representative of those willing to entertain different ideas, Thomas Dudley and Thomas Shepard typified those who took a more conservative stance. Dudley would be memorialized by his daughter, Anne Bradstreet, as being to sectaries a whip and maul, while Shepard himself called for axes and wedges to hew and break through the errors of the times. Dialogue was the key in trying to define the religious character of a community aspiring to be a city upon a hill. Initially, there were fruitful discussions that helped shape the churches, though these are often overlooked in favor of attention to the discussions that led to ruptures in the community of faith. Both are necessary for the full story. The formation of the first churches in the region involved discussions in which many found their views changed. In 1629, Plymouth Deacon Samuel Fuller traveled to Salem to offer his medical expertise to the newly arrived colonists who were suffering there. But he also discussed the principles of the Plymouth congregation, which many of the early Bay colonists were biased against because they viewed Plymouth as a rigid separatist church. The discussions were impactful, and Salem's John Endicott soon acknowledged that following these talks, he and many other Salemites had found that they and the Plymouth faithful were, as Endicott put it, servants of one master and of the same household. God's people, he explained, are all marked with one and the same mark, and sealed with one and the same seal, and have for the main one and the same heart, guided by one and the same spirit of truth. And where there is this, there can be no discord. Nay, there must be sweet harmony. Endicott wrote to Plymouth's Governor William Bradford that he was satisfied touching your judgments of the outward form of God's worship. Indeed, he had been convinced that, as far as I can yet gather, no other such form is warranted by the evidence of truth. While many of the congregations in the Bay, like Salem, came to follow the example of Plymouth, each shaped its practice individually. And as a result, there were differences to be found in the relative authority of clergy and congregants. Some churches accepted that the ordination received by clergymen in England was valid, and their calling to the congregation's ministry was merely an affirmation of their authority. Others required the ministerial candidate to renounce his English ordination and be ordained by the congregation itself to minister. Some churches insisted on the authority of the congregants over all matters, while others, such as the churches at Hingham and Newbury, followed a more Presbyterian practice, vesting authority in those the congregation chose as its officers. While there was a general unity in the practices of the New England churches, there was no uniformity, nor was uniformity sought. In addition to differences in practice, there were matters of belief where dialogue eventually led to unity. One instance of this involved Watertown. While all Puritans opposed the authority of the Catholic Church and rejected many of its ceremonies and practices, there were some who believed that despite its corruption, the Church of Rome was a true church. This was a position that was espoused by George Phillips, the pastor of the Watertown congregation, but it was troubling to many other colonists. The Boston Church sent 3 of its lay leaders, Winthrop, Dudley, and Isaac Nowell, to meet with the Watertown congregation and discuss the issues. Initially, Phillips and his church were persuaded by the delegation, but after they left, the church elder, Richard Brown, began again to assert the controversial position, leading the Boston delegation to return. After a day of fast, prayer, and further dialogue, the dissidents admitted their error. The use of dialogue and discussion to strive for unity was an important characteristic of living in a city on a hill, an important element of loving and caring for your neighbor as you hope they would care for you. And it was effective in these and many other cases, again, most of which are unfamiliar precisely because they resulted in harmony. When Isaac Nowell, who was a civil magistrate, was propounded to be an elder of the Boston Church, consultation with other churches in the Bay, as well as with the Plymouth congregation, led to an affirmation that no one should hold office in both state and church, which was a dramatic innovation in terms of the relationship between church and state in European society. Consultation led to the general acceptance of the baptizing of the children of church members, though decades later, the issue of who should be baptized would be raised again. When John Eliot preached a doctrine that was considered erroneous, his fellow clergymen John Cotton, Thomas Weld, and Thomas Hooker visited with him and brought him to acknowledge his error in that he had mistaken the grounds of his doctrine. Such harmony was advanced not only by formal discussion, but by informal practices. Men and women traveled on a regular basis to neighboring churches to listen to sermons. Handwritten treatises were circulated, and sermon notes were taken and shared. Seeking cohesion through compromise was a strategy that maintained peace and unity in this particular city on a hill. Of course, bad news is more exciting than good news, and more familiar than these instances of cooperation are the famous instances where dialogue failed, such as with Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. The basic stories here are well known, but I want to highlight the efforts to keep Williams and Hutchinson in the same body. Roger Williams, a charismatic personality recognized by John Winthrop as a godly minister, arrived in Massachusetts in 1631. His story illustrates both the Puritan search for further light and the limits on what would be tolerated by some. Williams believed that the Boston Church had not gone far enough in repudiating the Church of England, so he refused an offer to become one of that congregation's ministers and moved first to Salem and then to Plymouth, hoping to find a church more open to his views. Plymouth Colony's William Bradford called Williams a man godly and zealous, having many precious parts, but very unsettled in judgment. In 1633, Williams, according to Bradford, began to fall into some strange opinions, and from opinion into practice, which caused some controversy between the church and him. When the dispute could not be resolved, Williams requested and received his dismissal from the Plymouth congregation and moved back to Salem. As he pushed the logic of his religious beliefs to what he saw as their logical conclusions, Williams advanced views that tested the then defined orthodoxy of the region, that tested where the perimeter fence existed. He asserted that women should wear veils when they went in public, but especially in church services, as a sign that they had inherited Eve's corruption. He questioned the appropriateness of the Red Cross of St. George as a symbol on the English flag. He argued that regular meetings of the colony's clergy threatened the independence of individual congregations. He took the position that it was inappropriate for the king to have granted a charter to Massachusetts, since the monarch had no true claim to the land he was dispensing. And he asserted that the Second Commandment forbade the magistrates from administering an oath of loyalty to the colonist. The initial response was to debate the issues and seek resolution. And on a number of issues, Williams, if not accepting that he was wrong, agreed to refrain from advancing his views publicly. And some of the clergy persuaded the colony's Court of Assistants that the views expressed by Williams need not be punished. The Salem congregation was prepared to elect him to be pastor. But things changed when in April 1635, the colony's court decided that Williams had violated a pledge to keep certain of his views to himself. The court voted to ship him back to England, but warned by John Winthrop, Williams escaped Massachusetts, settling in what became Rhode Island, where he continued to pursue a more perfect form of Puritanism. While Williams was still in Massachusetts, William and Anne Hutchinson and their children arrived in Boston. They were quickly welcomed into the community. Anne earned a reputation for comforting the sick and as a valued midwife. She also continued a practice that she had begun in England, welcoming others into her home to discuss matters of faith. Such private conferences, a form of prophesying, were an important part of the Puritan movement, with individuals believed to have been particularly blessed with grace, helping others to understand and advance their spiritual lives. It was not unusual for such individuals to be women. John Winthrop would later write that during her early years in the colony, Anne Hutchinson was valued as one who appeared to rest the foundation of her beliefs on Christ. And Winthrop said the rule she pretended to walk by was only the scripture, conducting herself in the way of righteousness and kindness. There's no indication in Winthrop's journal or any other source that her views caused contention in the Boston church during the next few years. The Boston church was open to the search for further light. Inspired by the views of John Cotton, she, along with others arriving from a more radicalized English Puritan culture, such as William and Mary Dyer and Henry Vane, engaged in a search for further light on various aspects of faith. The first inklings of how explosive that search could become came in the form of a letter written to John Cotton by Thomas Shepard, newly arrived pastor of the Cambridge, Massachusetts congregation, and an individual scarred by his own experiences with radical Puritan sectaries in England. Shepard expressed concern about what he had heard of opinions circulating in the Boston church. Cotton replied diplomatically, writing that, as for differences in jars, it is my unfeigned desire to avoid them with all men, especially with brethren. Despite this reassurance, Shepard in Cambridge began to preach against what he believed to be heretical views being aired in Boston. And Shepard also raised the alarm among other clergy and mobilized them into action. I don't have time to deal with every aspect of the resulting controversy, one which is largely familiar to most of you, I'm sure, but a few points are in order. Faced with attacks on their understanding of how men were saved, supporters of Anne Hutchinson rejected dialogue and targeted Shepherd and other clergymen as advocates of a covenant of works. The religious community divided into competing factions or tribes, with each demonizing their opponents and exaggerating their positions, suggestive perhaps of modern politics. Each side abandoned any sense that it might be wrong, each becoming as intolerant as the other. Anne Hutchinson and her supporters were not interested in having their views tolerated, but in having the views of their opponents condemned and forbidden. An attempt to calm the waters by holding a fast day fell apart when John Wheelwright, Anne's kinsman, preached an inflammatory sermon calling upon the godly to take up arms against the errors of the day. Whether he intended spiritual or actual arms was left to the judgment of the audience. Religious conflict spilled into the civil sphere when Wheelwright was charged with sedition for his sermon. The result was a series of civil trials in which Thomas Dudley played a key role, and which resulted in the banishment of Anne and many of the Hutchinsonians. Less famous is the separate church trial, in which the members of the Boston congregation judged whether Anne Hutchinson was to be censured or excommunicated for her religious errors. And here we see a failed attempt to keep the community together. At that trial, Winthrop and the clergyman John Davenport, who was temporarily in Boston, tried to persuade Hutchinson to retract some of her more extreme views. In a lengthy exchange over the issue of whether the soul was immortal, which she was said to deny, Hutchinson acknowledged that, quote, "Now Mr. Davenport has opened it, it is clear to me, or God by him hath given me light." After more debate, during which she also acknowledged that she might have been mistaken on some other points, she was admonished by a vote of the entire congregation, and the trial temporarily adjourned. But pushed to go further when the trial resumed, Anne refused, and the church passed a judgment of excommunication. Even then, a few years later, the Boston church sent emissaries to Rhode Island to try and bring Hutchinson and her supporters back into the fold. Over the course of the following decades, there would be other disputes that tested the definition of orthodoxy, the role of synods, for instance, but the process of dialogue generally prevented disruptions on the scale of those of the 1630s. As in the case of the religious sphere, the civil governance of the Bay Colony was not imposed according to a predetermined plan, but was something that evolved through dialogue between opposing views, represented by the difference between Dudley's rigidity and Winthrop's flexibility. The end result was a governing framework within which the colonists themselves were empowered to debate the policies and the boundaries of what was to be accepted and rejected. Rarely did controversy cross the bounds of civility, and through dialogue, a consensus was eventually reached that became the New England way in terms of government and the regulation of society. As the Puritan colonists searched for further light regarding their understanding of how they should shape their institutions and redefine their beliefs, they never wavered on putting the ideas of the social gospel that they had advocated in England into practice in the New World. In England and New England, the imperative to assist the less fortunate members of the community led to practical efforts to care for others. John Winthrop, back in England, donated land on his Groton Manor estate for the construction of housing for the community's poor who had been displaced by new economic forces. Gathered congregations, such as that at Scrooby, were committed not only to assist one another spiritually, but as Robert Cushman pointed out in his treatise, A Cry of the Stone, the church and people of God go hand in hand, both in sickness and health, in poverty and in wealth, in adversity and prosperity, rejoicing together, weeping together, and being of like affection in a sweet and heavenly sympathy, holding out in adversity without shrinking, and persevering in prosperity with all moderation. In the town of Boxford, neighboring on Winthrop Scroton, the chief inhabitants of the parish signed an agreement in 1608 for the better ordering of society. Following a disastrous fire in 1613 in Dorchester, England, the Puritan clergyman John White, who would be heavily involved in New England colonizing ventures, launched a campaign to expand poor relief, support a hospital and school, and improve care for the sick and elderly. This was the Puritan social gospel. Such Christian charity would be pervasive in New England as well. During the first winter, many of the Mayflower passengers sickened and died. Almost half died. At the height of the crisis, William Brewster and Miles Standish, two of the very few who were not gravely ill, fetched wood to keep the fires going in the building where the sick lay. They made the beds, dressed the sick, and performed, as William Bradford recorded, all the homely and necessary offices for them which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to be named. Looking back at the early days of Massachusetts, Cotton Mather would initially identify John Winthrop as the American Nehemiah because of his activities in the first struggling year of Massachusetts, working in the field with other colonists and sharing his supplies with those who lacked food. Using another biblical analogy, Mather extolled the Massachusetts governor for having been like Joseph, unto whom the whole body of the people repaired when their corn failed them, Winthrop supplying them from his own stores. The covenants of the early churches of New England, all in one way or another, pledged the congregants to mutual love and support, spiritual, but also explicitly material in some cases. Thus, the covenant of the Concord, Massachusetts church, formed in 1636, rejected what they called the yoke and burdening traditions they had left behind in England, and they promised to carefully avoid all oppression and hard dealing. Each New England congregation appointed 2 or 3 individuals to the office of deacon. These men collected weekly donations for the minister's salaries, but also for the church stock, from which they dispensed funds to those in need. The same spirit was to be found in civil society as well as congregational life, beginning with the Mayflower Compact in 1620. John White, who had organized help for the needy of Dorchester, England, urged John Winthrop to provide for a public storehouse for the relief of the poor, sick, and infirm in the colony. Colony records are filled with specific appropriations to aid the needy. In 1640, the Massachusetts General Court granted 30 bushels of corn to a person in distress. 6 years later, it remitted taxes for those who were poor as a result of sickness or other infirmities, and also remitted fines on 5 men, provided they could demonstrate that they were poor. What can we make of all this? The Puritan colonists defined their community restrictively by our standards, though it should be pointed out that both Blacks and natives were considered to be eligible to receive God's saving grace and to join the church. But this was restrictive. The Puritans found no place for Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, and others whom I have not discussed, such as Thomas Morton, Samuel Gorton, and various Quakers. But they insisted that all who were a part of the society work and sacrifice for the common good. While this social gospel wasn't unique to Puritans, it did become deeply rooted in New England, thanks in part to the urgings of Cushman, Winthrop, and their fellow Congregationalists. And just as the American understanding of the assertion in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal has expanded to include many who would not have been thought of by the founders, so too the target of the Puritan social gospel has been expanded in ways that the Puritans would never have considered. Following the 17th century, New Englanders would take the lead in advancing causes such as abolition, the humane treatment of the insane, and universal education, just to mention a very few. The Congregationalist clergyman Washington Gladden would be one of the key figures in the social gospel movement in late 19th and early 20th century. The conflict between individualism and communalism, between the freedom of the individual and the constraints of society, a conflict which engaged Robert Cushman and John Winthrop in the 17th century, has reemerged in our times. President Ronald Reagan, who more than any other modern American politician was known for invoking Winthrop's image of a city on a hill, was nevertheless instrumental in arguing for an individual freedom cut loose from the social burdens and responsibilities that Winthrop had insisted upon. But at roughly the same time, President Jimmy Carter, who arguably is in the broad evangelical Protestant tradition that encompasses the Puritans, spoke against what he called the path that leads to fragmentation and self-interest, warning that down that road lies the mistaken idea of freedom, the right to grasp for ourselves some advantage over others. And in my own lifetime, the call for communal responsibility has often drawn on the words of Winthrop's Christian charity sermon. In 1988, accepting the Democratic Party nomination for the presidency of the United States, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis urged the nation to embrace, quote, the idea of community, the idea that we are in this together, that regardless of who we are or where we come from or how much money we have, each of us counts. And that by working together to create opportunity and a good life for all of us are enriched, not just in economic terms, but as citizens and as human beings. The idea of community Dukakis talked about was not, as some today would claim, a socialist plot alien to America, but according to the Massachusetts governor of 1988, it was an idea that was planted in the New World by the first governor of Massachusetts. And more recently, following the Boston Marathon bombing, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren declared that in times of calamity, in times like these, we remember the words of John Winthrop, who counseled the founders of Boston to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must delight in each other. make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Words that were meaningful in the 17th century, words that are equally meaningful today, and are a part of the Puritan legacy that needs to be remembered. Thank you very much. Stunned silence.
Yeah, I know. I had to figure out how to unmute. Thanks a lot. That was a fine talk. There are some questions, and I would like to ask, first of all, it looks like from the record, only about half of the persons actually ever became members of the church. Do we have any commentary from persons who are not church members about what their life was like in colonial Massachusetts?
Yeah, we have to understand what church membership is.
Yep.
Everyone in the community went to church. I think there's ample evidence that the vast majority of members of every community were in accord with the principles of the Puritan community.
Yep.
No one forced you to come to Massachusetts if you were a middle-class Englishman, and that's most of the people who came. To be a member of the church, you needed to believe yourself and to be perceived by others to have received God's saving grace.
Yep.
And that's something that could occur very early in your life. It could be something that occurred very late in your life. Many people did not ask to be full members because they were not sure that they were worthy, essentially. They were not convinced that they had felt God's caress, that love from the divine. But they all listened to sermons. They all were counseled by the clergy. They all contributed to the church stock that would help those who were weak. And they all, were in agreement with the shaping of the covenant. So it's a community that where church membership is important, but the religious culture extends beyond the full members of the congregation.
Let me see what we have for comments in the chat field here. The first question is, did the Puritans have roughly the same concept of love, example, love thy neighbor as thyself, as we did together? How was love and that word used?
Yeah. In the sense of the social gospel, it's used as an expression of charity, of openness, of doing unto your neighbor as you would have them do unto you. There's an affectionate element to it. Abraham Van Engen has written a book, his first book, which talks a lot about the affective elements in Puritanism. Mm-hmm. You also have, more on a more micro level, the love between parents and children, husbands and wives, and so forth. But it's essentially boiled down to love thy neighbor as thyself. Winthrop's sermon is referred to as the Christian charity sermon, and love is charity in that sense. Charity is love. So that's the context, yeah.
Okay. So perhaps less romantic than we use the word today, but certainly Winthrop's letters to his dear wife Margaret are full of affection, if nothing else. And
Well, yeah,
desire to
and
be
and
together.
Bradstreet, yeah, and then Bradstreet's poetry. I mean, they on a family level, Puritans expressed themselves with great fondness, with great love. I think one of the great instances of this, which I wrote about years ago in my biography of John Winthrop, is that when he was leaving for America and Margaret was staying behind in Groton to help finalize the sale of the manor house and watch after a few of the children, the young children, they made a pact. And once a day, when they were separated, once a week rather, when they were separated at 5 o'clock on a specified day, I think it was Thursday, I might be wrong on that, they would spend time sort of almost as we might say telecommunicating with, thinking of one another, sending their fond thoughts to the other across the vast expanse of the ocean. So yeah, and again, as I said, Anne Bradstreet's poetry, there's a tremendous.
Winthrop apologized once for having forgotten to do it that week in one of his letters. So I mean, there was something they were serious about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's nice. The next question has to do with, please explain this sense of the common good in light of the Salem witch trials. Is there a great differentiation between the Restoration, after the Restoration, and before the Restoration in 1660? How we should view the social good and the consensus and all that stuff in Boston and in New England?
Yeah. By the time you're getting down into the 1690s, you're getting into a very different society. You've sorry about that.
Oh, that's you. Good. I turned mine off.
Yeah, John Winthrop didn't have that problem. He wasn't interrupted by his telephone.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, by the time you get, and you mentioned the Restoration, yeah, post 1660, you have a much larger percentage of the population that is not Puritan. You have, I think, I would argue, a greater rigidity or conservatism in Puritanism itself, which was threatened in the eyes of many people by the large number of immigrants that were coming to take advantage of economic opportunities and not for religious reasons. You also have attacks by the crown leading to the revocation of the charter in 1684, and then ultimately a new charter. So I think it's a good question as to where charity goes in the 1690s in Salem and the neighboring communities, but one that would take a lot of time for us to go into, maybe on another occasion.
Good. Well, that lays a groundwork. Do you want to make any comment on the witch trials? Yeah, that's what we all say.
Yeah, no. There's a lot, and I don't have a problem with talking more about it, but fundamentally with the witch trials, I think you have to recognize the local dynamics, which Boyer and Nissenbaum talk about in terms of the relationship between the seaport of Salem and Salem Village, where the episode begins, which is a rural parish, essentially. I think the concerns, the general sense of anxiety as to what is happening in New England because of the Indian Wars, the loss of the charter, economic turmoil, creates an anxiety and a look for what could be causing this, and ultimately turning towards the devil. I think the policy of accepting spectral evidence, which was actually advised against by the clergy, but pushed on the Court of Oyer and Terminer by William Stoughton. There are a lot of things that go into it. It can't be excused. It's not typical of New England. If you look at the long history of witchcraft, most people who were charged are never brought up on trial, and most people who were tried, not all of them, but most of them are actually exonerated.
Yeah. Let's see. Scott McDermott, who's our speaker next week, asks, Dr. Bremer, thank you for this wonderful talk. How would you respond to the post-revisionist British historians who have suggested that Puritan charity in England was an attempt to control the lower classes motivated by fear and mistrust?
No, I think the upper classes were doing a pretty good job of dominating the lower classes without any help from middle class Puritans. That was somewhat snide, but apologies. No, I mean, you can argue that Puritanism is an effort to get more work out of the laboring classes. You can also argue that Puritanism is a radical movement. After all, the levelers, the diggers, groups like that come out of the Puritan movement. Now, what I would also just sort of say as a general comment, and what I've been trying to do in my work over the years, and even a little bit in tonight's talk, we shouldn't generalize about the Puritans. Because just as I talked about differences between Winthrop and Dudley, there are differences on matters of sexuality. Most Puritans embrace sexuality. Some people, like the clergy poet Michael Wigglesworth, are appalled by it. When you're talking about economic activities, there's a tremendous amount of disagreement as to what a just price is, and should a just price be imposed on people. Robert Kane in Boston gets into all sorts of trouble like that. And the same thing is true in England. I mean, but in England, you know, if you look at the results of the Puritan Revolution by Oliver Cromwell, who, as he admitted, had his warts, and there were political warts as well as physical ones with Cromwell, you know, you have a movement towards what is essentially a more Republican, small r type of government, which more representation by the people. And ultimately, because there are so many different Puritanisms, and not everyone knows how to agree, you get a movement towards religious liberty, which is promoted by English independents and ultimately Baptists and Presbyterians and so forth. So I mean, you have to be careful. I mean, you can, if you look hard enough, you can probably find some person identified as a Puritan to support almost any hypothesis you want to raise. But as a generalization, no, I don't see Puritanism as an attempt to suppress the lower classes, in part because Puritans didn't have any real.
And I think Scott was making that point that may have been the case in England rather than in New England.
Yeah, I don't see it in England. You know, we could have a discussion of that, but I mean, among other things, Puritans, it depends on what you mean by control. I mean, if you're looking at the Scrooby congregation, they did not have control over anyone, not even over themselves, which is why they ended up leaving England for the Netherlands. If you look at people like John Winthrop, I mean, he's takes steps. If you look at some of the bills that he's associated with in the 1620s, when he was advising some parliamentary committees, they're generally laws that are in the direction of helping the various levels of society. So I mean, you know, we'll
Yeah.
see. We'll see what Scott offers.
Here's a question on Anne Hutchinson. If John Winthrop traveled to Aquidneck, which he didn't, he sent his emissaries to plead with
Right.
Anne Hutchinson to return to the fold, why did she then pack up her hard-won community and fled south to what is now the Bronx? I mean, she just packed up her family, right?
Well, she leaves in part because of divisions in the Rhode Island community itself.
Yeah.
You know, in essence, she had disagreements with John Clark. She had disagreements with Coddington and others within that community. And so
And
after
they wanted to continue to have a good relationship with Boston. And I think that when the emissaries came, she slammed the door in their face, I think.
Yeah, well, the emissaries come from the church and they offer, and she said no. But yeah, there are other people that are there, and Coddington is one that are willing to make up. And one of the things that I have to be honest, because I haven't researched it that much, and I don't know, I think Eve was with us, and she might know, is whether or not some of Anne's children that left with her for Rhode Island came back, because I know there are Hutchinsons that are important in First Church Boston in the 1660s and so forth. But I don't know if they're children who never left with her or children who left and came back.
I think they didn't leave with her. I think her two oldest children stayed in Boston.
Okay.
Yeah. A question on Cotton Mather and how he justified, and whether he justified slavery by saying that two races had equal souls but not equal bodies, so that the African race was more suited for labor. Did the Puritans believe that slaves should be treated as equal, and what attitude did they hold? It's a good question, but a rough one.
Okay, first of all, Puritans believed that Africans and Native Americans had souls and that they could receive God's saving grace and they could be admitted into churches. Yep. So John Winthrop in, I think it's about 1643, notes positively in his journal that there was a black slave in Ipswich. I'm blanking on the place. Mm-hmm. That was admitted to the church. And the point of fact, we talked about church admission before. This slave's owners were not church members. Mm-hmm. So if you take church membership as closest by far to God, here you have a black slave who's a church member and others. There are natives who were admitted to churches. We talk about the praying towns, but who were also empowered to bring the gospel to others. Mm-hmm. There were a few black slaves that spread the gospel. Now, the big question is, do Massachusetts, in the Massachusetts Law Code, they allow slavery, which was pretty much universally admitted in all the colonies, but it's made statutory. But what is critical, if you look at the actual statute, is that individuals, and it doesn't specify by race, cannot be enslaved other than by warfare. Captives in war can be enslaved. People can be reduced to slavery for certain heinous offenses. But it says nothing about an inherited status. And in fact, the children
were not
slaves were not slaves.
Yep.
And additionally, if you look at the education statutes, slaves, as well as other servants, were to be educated. Heads of household were legally responsible for making sure that all members of their household, female as well as male, servant as well as free, had to be able to read, were to be taught to read in order to be able to read the Bible. Cotton Mather, when we talk about Mather, he organizes the Society of Negroes, as he calls it, where you have blacks who were church members gathering together in Boston. And this is later than the period we're talking about, but gathering together in Boston to share their religious ideas, to share scripture readings, to sing psalms, much as, interestingly, we might have imagined happening in the household of Anne Hutchinson in Boston in 1635 and 1636, a gathering outside the church of believers coming to share their faith with one another.
Yeah. Our walking tour, one of the walking tours is called the Third Generation, and it starts at the home site of John Wampus, a Native American who lived in Boston, and ends in the home site of a free black woman who also lived in Boston and lived her whole life as a free person and was black. So I mean, yes, I mean there was lots of room for different kinds of people in old Boston.
The last thing I'll just also say about this, John, and just because every now and then it's nice to confuse the issue. When we talk about slavery, we all too readily conjure up images of Tara and Gone with the Wind and what slavery was like, or Uncle Tom's Cabin. We don't have a lot of information on what the actual nature of slavery was like in early New England. And one of the things which has fascinated me, and I used to discuss it with John Thornton, who now teaches at Boston University, teaches African history. He was a colleague at Millersville for many years. One of the things we often wondered at is if you look at the 1630 Massachusetts colony records, you have about a half dozen white servants who committed offenses, and the court reduced them to slavery, is the phrasing that is used. So you have some white slaves in Boston. Now, the sentence was remitted in at least some of the cases after a number of years, but it was logical, because if you have a servant who commits a crime, steals from you or whatnot, how do you punish the servant?
Yep.
You can't find the servant doesn't have money. You can't lock the servant up, because who does that punish? The owner or the master, who's deprived of the servant's abilities. So what do? You reduce them to slavery, which in essence is lifetime servitude, unless the court comes back and says, well, you've been here enough, you can now go free.
Yeah. This is a long and complicated question about a person who's working on the Wobben's Praying Town in Nantum, asking how would you explain why Puritans like Winthrop believes that they should love their neighbors as themselves, but not consider even indigenous Christians as their neighbors? I don't know that they didn't consider them as their neighbors, but the question is about the praying towns and their status as communities.
Yeah, no, I mean, they did consider themselves brothers and sisters in Christ. As far as even those who were not Christians, if you look at Winthrop's journal, I mean, you can say that it's diplomacy, but he first of all, he deals with native leaders as if they were governors of New Netherlands or elsewhere. He, on a number of occasions, at least we know, he brings them into his home to entertain them on these things. He has a relationship of sorts with Sagamore John in the first years of the colony. And the praying towns are an expression, if you want, of Christian charity. First of all, while we acknowledge that in many respects, many of the colonists will be guilty of, particularly over time and getting beyond Winthrop's time, of doing everything they can to take over native land. The praying towns are large amounts of acreage which are deeded to natives to live in without the English being able to use that land. The efforts that go into John Eliot and native translators like Printer James and others that Lisa Brooks talks about to take an oral language, to figure out how to express it in terms of written words, and then to translate the entire scriptures into that language so that these people who might have the gift of God's grace in their souls can approach the divine properly through the reading of scriptures. I mean, this might not be how we would go about things, but there's an enormous undertaking. I mean, sit down at some time and decide that you're simply going to take your Bible and you're going to copy the whole thing without having to translate it. The amount of time that that's going to take, the setting of it into type, the printing of it. You know, again, there are Puritans who are more, particularly as time goes on, likely to reject natives and native life. But I think that there is an effort made, and I think that it's important to recognize that while there might be some natives who converted for what we might identify as practical reasons, I think we have to accept the fact that there was enough of an effort made so that some Native Americans were persuaded of the gospel and who truly adopted Christianity. And in many cases, that has passed down, where you have, you know, whether it be in Natick, whether it be on Martha's Vineyard, whether it be in some of the other areas in southeastern Massachusetts, there's a long tradition there.
Here's one that I wish we had time to answer. Do you want to identify the books behind you?
Well,
there are one or two that are some interest.
There's my bio. This is Jeremy Pang's history of the Pilgrims in Leiden. That's one of mine. David Hall's new book on the Puritans. Mark Peterson's book on Boston. There are some books here, none of mine because I wasn't eligible, are actually stacked there because I've been looking at them. They're nominations for the first Winthrop Prize for the best book in 17th century.
I bought the John Winthrop biography from you probably 10 years ago before I was associated with the partnership, and you endorsed it and saying, I hope we get to meet again someday. It seemed to have worked.
And right behind on shelves as opposed to stacks are actually the Winthrop papers and various other things of that sort. But
one from Mark Kohler, who's also going to be a speaker for us. Do you think that Bishop Gilbert Sheldon destroyed the Puritan movement in England as Archbishop of Canterbury? The question is, how opposed were English to the Puritans, and how did they attempt to destroy it if they did?
Well, you're talking
right, exactly.
Post-Restoration, yeah. You know, obviously, pre-1640, all the efforts to destroy Puritanism were largely driven by, well, particularly Charles I and Archbishop William Laud and his henchmen and so forth. After the Restoration, there's a period where there are some clergymen, some bishops in the Church of England who are open to discussions with Richard Baxter and others for some sort of accommodation of Puritans. But rapidly that's ended. The Clarendon codes place very harsh penalties on any gathering of Puritans, and there still be underground things and so forth. But basically you're in a sense, you're allowed to be a Puritan after the Clarendon codes, but you can't hold office, including a seat in Parliament. You can't go to the universities of Oxford or Cambridge. You can't hold municipal office, and you can't meet in a crowd of more than about 5 people. So you're free, if you call that free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and congregationalism in England is hard to find. When we were over there, I tried to find congregational churches, and all I could find was one congregational congregation shared a church with some other congregation, with other units, other groups.
Yeah, I mean, they're more likely to be called independent.
Yep.
Because during the civil wars and protectorate regime, most Congregationalists are referred to as independents because they were accepting, if the Westminster Confession was adopted, and a Presbyterian establishment was to be imposed, which for a time it seemed to be, the Congregationalists were demanding that they be independent of any such establishment. And so they get referred to as the independents. A lot of overlap with Baptists as well at the same time. But there's up in Norwich, there's some independent churches, and Yarmouth as well, a few other places. Yeah.
We have a question. What are some recent books on Puritans that you would recommend? And it's kind of it's the same person has sent in the same question, another question about did the Puritans split apart after the Restoration because of internal disagreements? So questions about what books would talk about disagreements, internal disagreements amongst the different Puritan groups.
Let me suggest a couple of things. One, and I say this with some modesty, if you're not tired of hearing my views and want something short, Oxford University Press publishes a series of very short introductions. Mm-hmm. And I wrote the one, Puritanism, a very short introduction.
Yep.
And that's a good start. If you want something more complex,
I can hold it up. This is it right here. It's a good book.
Yep.
Yep.
David Hall, who's over at Harvard Divinity, has The Puritans, a transatlantic history, which is very detailed, very scholarly, and very excellent. I mean, and this is the newest thing. There's also the third one I would recommend is called Hot Protestants, mm-hmm. and it refers to the intensity of their zeal, by Michael Winship, W-I-N-S-H-I-P. And Mike's book and David's book are the two recent sort of surveys of the whole shebang.
Okay. Voting in colonial Boston, did you have to be a member of a church? We got a couple more minutes, but we're almost done. Okay. Did you have to be a member of the church to vote?
Depends on the period.
And thank you for an excellent talk too.
Yeah. Okay. When the franchises first expanded in the very early 1630s, anyone who had emigrated and was a head of a household could be admitted to freemanship.
Yep.
Then it was restricted to those who were church members, which at the time when that restriction came in was a majority of the population. Later in the 1660s, you didn't have to be a member of a church, but you needed basically a clergyman's recommendation. And that was in part bowing to some of the pressures from the Restoration government of Charles II. And then after the loss of the charter, under the new charter of 1692, then all religious tests for the franchise were eliminated.
Okay. This is sort of the last one. Roxanne, who's one of our trustees, says, I found myself during your talk starting to reimagine the particularly early New England the 17th century hippies, earnestly forming communes and trying to form a more perfect society than what they left behind. Thank you. Do you agree with her?
Could you repeat it? I'm not.
Were the Puritans the hippies of the 17th century?
I think I understood it. One of my first sort of.
I think Roxanne is asking you about emotional bonding.
Yeah, I want to say something which might not be exactly on her point, but it approaches her point. My first book, other than a general synthesis, the Puritan experiment, was Congregational Communion, and what it was an attempt to look at connections among all the congregational clergy in the 17th century and the early 17th century, and how they bound together and everything. And one of the people who read it early on was Christopher Hill. And Christopher Hill, as some will know, is a great Marxist historian of Puritanism and all this. And Christopher was, until he left after the Hungarian uprising, he was a communist. And he wrote to me and he said, this was a wonderful book. And it reminded me a lot of essentially the communist meetings that he was a part of when he was a young man, with the vision of a better world and the sort of religious enthusiasm for it and everything. And it was interesting, and it was an appreciated comment very much.
Fine way to end, and thank you so very, very much for your generosity and your interest and your enthusiasm and all of the help that you've given to the partnership over the many, many years you've been one of our advisors. We wouldn't
many more to come.
Good. We would not be the organization that we are without your help. And that's about it, I think. Hang on a sec. Thank you so very much, says Mark. Great talk, says Roxanne. You are the best, says Elizabeth Peeler. And I second all of those. Thank you so very much. Okay, and recording. Hello. I'm going to close this up now. It's been nice with everybody. In 1 week, we have another one next Monday. We have Mark Kohler will be talking with us. I mean, we'll be meeting again.
Scott McDermott.
Yeah, thank you, Scott McDermott. We'll be meeting again next week. Ready to leave? Leaving.